welcome to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm the producer and your host today, Deborah Sloss, licensed marriage and family therapist, and my pronouns are she, her. Today we're going to be talking about psychotic symptoms, which can be part of many illnesses. The word psychosis is used to describe conditions that affect the mind, in which people have trouble distinguishing what is real and what is not. When this occurs, it's called a psychotic episode. A first episode of psychosis is often frightening, confusing, and distressing for the person experiencing it, and for family members, friends, teachers, and coworkers witnessing it. Psychosis is a symptom, not an illness, and it's more common than you may think. In the U.S., approximately 100,000 young people experience psychosis each year, and as many as 3 out of every 100 people will experience an episode of psychosis in their lifetime. Sadly, it's not uncommon for a person to have psychotic symptoms for more than a year before receiving treatment. Early treatment of psychotic symptoms is critical because it often means better recovery. Understanding more about and learning to recognize psychotic symptoms means we're in a better position to try to help those experiencing psychosis to get the care and treatment they need sooner. Joining me for this conversation is Dr. Jennifer Davis, a double board-certified general and child and adolescent psychiatrist practicing in Santa Cruz, California. Having grown up with an older sibling struggling with significant ADHD, Dr. Davis went into the field of psychiatry with a passion for wanting to help other people improve the quality of their lives. Later, she personally was touched by the detrimental effects of severe psychotic symptoms affecting a close loved one who refused treatment due to limited insight into their condition and out of concern for the side effects of the available treatments at that time. During the course of her career, she's been encouraged by seeing tremendous treatment improvements come into the field of psychiatry, especially pertaining to treatments for psychotic symptoms. She's excited to talk about some of those today and remains ever hopeful for what new treatments will come next. Tim Beveridge was born and raised in Santa Cruz and lives there to this day. He identifies as a peer in recovery from schizoaffective bipolar disorder, as well as anxiety. Tim's mental health struggles began after a series of head injuries at age 16. He began his mental health recovery after his second hospitalization in 2019 at age 27, which is right around the time he also found his way to NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. After attending some support groups, he began to get involved with NAMI as a support group facilitator and as a speaker in hospitals and classrooms. Eventually, he began working as a peer counselor at Second Story, a Santa Cruz peer-run respite house where he continues to work to this day. Also with us is Kenah Roberts, who uses the pronouns they, them. Kenah grew up in Santa Cruz County, California, where they recently returned to live after a 24-year hiatus in the Seattle, Washington area. Their diagnoses include schizoaffective bipolar disorder and PTSD, and they've been living with psychotic symptoms since the age of 15. Kenah is a peer specialist and helps facilitate NAMI groups in Santa Cruz, California. Their experience with psychosis over the years and how that relates to mental health crises and wellness is what they wish to share with listeners today. I want to alert listeners that today's show includes some discussion about having thoughts of violence and may not be appropriate for all listeners. Welcome to State of Mind, Dr. Davis, Tim, and Kenah.
Thanks for having me.
Glad to be here.
It's an honor to be here.
Dr. Davis, I want to begin with you. Can you just start by defining and describing and giving some examples of what psychotic symptoms are?
Absolutely. So psychotic symptoms, there are a number of them. In a nutshell, we categorize them, 5 main ones: delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, and negative symptoms. So I'll start with the 2 most common ones that people recognize. Hallucinations. So hallucinations are experiencing anything of the senses. It could be auditory, visual, feeling, tactile, smelling, taste, any of the senses. And yet there isn't an actual stimulus for those. So just like you hear my voice now, someone with auditory hallucinations will hear something, and yet there is no one talking to them. It's usually voices that they hear, but it could be any sound actually. And same with visual. So the most common would be auditory hallucinations, but anything of the senses can be a hallucination. Delusions I'll often describe as it's like being in a dream, but you're wide awake. So it's something you experience happening, and yet it's not really happening. So it might be that you feel you're being watched, that people are out to get you, and yet no one is, right? So it's very much like being in a dream, right? And yet it's not happening. So that would be the main two ones that most people recognize. Disorganized speech can be where people when it's really bad, we call it word salad, where they're just talking and none of it makes sense. It's not making sentences. It's just words all over the place. But we can see things like people having flight of ideas, which is where they're having just rapid thoughts coming at them. And so their speech subsequently is often all over the place. And then we can also see disorganized behavior, even motoric elements can come into some of that. But people can show different motor signs. They can definitely act in ways that don't seem logical, right, with their behavior. And then finally, there are negative symptoms. Negative symptoms are where we see people not have much in the way of facial expression, right? It's sort of, or they have difficulty with planning how they're going to live their day. So it's not what we call positive symptoms, which are the other things that you would see outwardly, but a lack of things that make, how humans usually behave, what we would call more typical.
So, what are the types of conditions that can produce psychosis or psychotic symptoms? And are there specific symptoms that tend to be associated with particular illnesses?
So, the most common one, if we were to call it more of a psychiatric condition, separate and apart from other medical, would be schizophrenia. And within that, there's a number of different kinds of schizophrenia. We'll break it down and label it different ways, but auditory hallucinations are most common in schizophrenia as opposed to the other sensory type hallucinations. And then I'll move off of schizophrenia and just say then there's schizoaffective disorder, right? Which both of our guests here today have mentioned that they've been diagnosed with that one. And that can have psychotic symptoms in addition to mood symptoms. Then there are mood disorders that can have psychotic symptoms. So depression can actually have psychotic symptoms, and bipolar disorder can have psychotic symptoms. There are other, under schizophrenia, forms of disorders such as a brief psychotic disorder, which is more time limited. It's a very brief episode of psychosis. Schizophreniform disorder is a little bit longer than a brief psychotic disorder, but would be shorter than schizophrenia, with schizophrenia being a disorder that lasts the longest time period. So those three are kind of differentiated based on the timing of how long those episodes can last, if that makes sense.
So, Dr. Davis, can you just also describe if psychotic symptoms or psychosis are often part of other medical conditions and or other mental health conditions that people don't usually associate with psychotic symptoms?
Absolutely. So, other mental health conditions that can present with psychosis, trauma, with severe enough trauma, PTSD, people can have psychotic symptoms. Um, Definitely a lack of sleep, right, which is a part of many mental health disorders. So, severe lack of sleep can lead to psychosis as well.
Are there some people who are potentially more vulnerable to developing psychotic symptoms, and what are some of those risk factors?
So, yes, definitely a lot of the psychotic disorders, the disorders that can have psychosis, have a genetic component. So, people who have a family member who suffers from psychosis would be more likely to be at risk. There are genes associated with psychosis. So, for instance, schizophrenia has about 108 genes that I last heard of associated with it. Now, all of us actually have some of those genes. It's whether we have enough of them as to whether we get the disorder. So we all have some of those genes, but most of us don't have enough or the right combo or what we call epigenetic factors, which are factors that can turn on those genes. So, for instance, marijuana is one of those things. We know of at least two genes associated with marijuana turning on the rest of the condition. Most of us, if we were to smoke, we're not going to get schizophrenia. But if you have one of those two genes and enough of the other genes, then that might trigger that disorder. So, genetics is a big part of being at risk. And then again, trauma. We definitely see an association with people who've had severe trauma being at a higher risk for having psychotic disorders.
Well, also with us today is Tim, who's here to share about his experience of living with a mental health condition that includes psychotic symptoms. Tim, can you tell us about when you first started having mental health challenges, when your psychotic symptoms began, and what was that like for you?
Well, I first started having mental health challenges when I was around 16 after a series of head injuries. I had a few concussions that were right back to back with each other. And I that was the first time I really kind of started having a lot of more severe mental health, difficulties beyond anxiety or anything like that. I had a complete shift in personality, actually. It was like I went from being this really well, mannered, just kind of easygoing guy to kind of being more aggressive, angry, impulsive, and it was just like this switch went off right after my third one. And it just kind of, I remember vividly just coming out of the doctor's office and my dad said something to me. It was something about like, I think I was trying to argue with him about playing football more. I wanted to keep playing football. And basically, he, instead of just kind of responding in a really reasonable manner, I yelled at him and I threw something on the ground and I got in the car, which was completely out of my nature. My psychotic symptoms, though, um, those kind of began right around, right at that same period. And I remember the first symptoms being this very faint chatter. However, I was so certain it was about me. It was like every once in a while, I would just catch my name, or I would catch that it was about me, it was like I always felt like all eyes were on me. It's kind of like that delusion of, feeling, I wouldn't call it, necessarily persecution, but it was almost just kind of like always being watched, so to speak. Um, and yeah, those were like the two time, first real symptoms I had, and that was around age 16.
So you also told me you tried to deal with your symptoms on your own for quite a while. And could you talk some about what you were doing and how did that go for you?
Well, I started smoking a lot of weed in college. My symptoms had started to get a lot worse. And basically, I tried to self medicate. Um, and that was something that ended up just making my symptoms a lot worse. I started to socially isolate a lot more. I withdrew just in general. But when I did go out, it was kind of like I still felt like I had that all eyes on me attitude. And it was difficult. It was very difficult.
So, Dr. Davis, as you listen to Tim's story, did anything stand out to you as very common with the patients that you've worked with, or did anything seem particularly unique to Tim's experience?
Well, what I think would be very common is that experience of it's very real. It was very real to Tim when he heard that and felt that, people were maybe watching him or commenting on him. That was a very real experience to him in that moment. And that is often the way it is for people. We talk about whether someone has insight or lack of insight. Some people know that what they're experiencing is absolutely not real, and that is having insight into it. But especially in the beginning, when someone is first experiencing these symptoms and they've never had it before, they're not aware that it's not real. And so we call that a lack of insight. And with a lack of insight, you can imagine, well, why would I get something treated if there's nothing abnormal going on for me? This is real to me. So why would I go get treatment? Right? That's how most people would think about it.
Yeah, like Tim now can reflect that his response to his dad was over the top or out of the ordinary for him. But at the moment, I imagine you were just upset with what your dad said.
I was just very upset. I didn't understand why I was reacting that way. I think in the moment, even I knew it was a little unnatural of me, but I just thought, whatever. Like, it is what it is. And one of the things I wanted to say about it not being real too is that, or not feeling, or feeling real. Sorry, but one of the things I wanted to say about it feeling so real is that I only knew in hindsight that it wasn't real. It was like I had to look back in hindsight, maybe, years later and say, you were hearing these things talking about you so often and so frequently. There's no way it could be real. There's no way it could have been real. It's kind of like, it was the same kind of thing where I think that at the time, there was this little tiny piece inside of me that might have known that, but I didn't really have the wherewithal to look at that or listen to it. It was like it all just seemed legitimate.
And that makes sense that's why you didn't go seek treatment, because it seems so real. And that is the case for so many people, is that it on average can take up to a year before most people seek treatment, right? And I think a big part of that is they don't recognize that what they're experiencing is actually not real. And again, why would you seek treatment for something that you don't see as not happening, right?
What's funny is when I first sought treatment, I sought treatment for anxiety and depression. It wasn't even for voices in my head or anything like that. It was just anxiety and depression. I'm like, I'm normal. This is all normal. It'll be fine. So,
I think that's really common, actually, that people don't talk about that aspect or the hallucination aspect of it for quite some time in their treatment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is really important what you're doing here with this, getting this information out about what psychosis is, because many people may be experiencing it, but don't even know that it is a thing or that it exists or that they're experiencing it. And just like Tim going in for treatment for anxiety and depression, those were things he could recognize. I'm not supposed to feel this way. Right. So he went in for treatment, but the rest, he didn't realize he was experiencing something that he should not be.
yeah, absolutely. It basically took me getting to the point of, feeling that having a daylight moment where I was going, you're having telepathic conversations with people. You should probably get in and see somebody, and people kind of telling me something was wrong. So,
And the other common thing is that you turn to other things to help you. And that is so common. So many people will turn to other kinds of substances to try and mute what they're experiencing, dampen it, right? And like you said, unfortunately, that's not the right treatment for that condition. And in fact, it can make it worse.
You're listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and today we're discussing living with and recovering from mental illnesses that include psychotic symptoms. Joining me for this conversation is Dr. Jennifer Davis, a double board-certified general and child and adolescent psychiatrist. Also with us are two amazing peers who are both in recovery from their mental illnesses. Peer counselor Tim Beveridge, and peer specialist Kenah Roberts. Listeners of today's show may also want to check out episode 27, titled Mental Health Crisis Toolkit, which discusses how to reduce and still be prepared for mental health crisis episodes, when and how to use our mental health crisis response systems, and how to have a smooth as possible experience when doing so. That and many other episodes can be found in our archives at www.stateofmindmedia.org. Back to our interview. Well, I also want to welcome Kenah, who's with us today to share their experiences with psychosis. Kenah, you've had an even longer journey with mental illness that's included psychotic symptoms. Can you share some about how that began and progressed for you?
Yes, thank you. So I kind of began my dance with mental illness when I was about 15, and I went into a deep depression. And I didn't know that's what it was, but I was having these certain feelings of sadness and also numbness and bleakness. And I got it into my head, and I believe this was a delusion, that my purpose on earth was to make the world a better place through less suffering. And the way I was going to do that was to kill my family and myself. And that's pretty extreme, right? But that is what I thought. That is the thought that came and settled into my brain, and it took over. And I started developing a plan for carrying that out. Now, I was really lucky in that the trajectory of my depression eventually brought me down far enough that I wasn't able to follow through with any actions. I simply became inert. I would just sit all day long. I couldn't do anything. So I count that as so incredibly lucky. I know that in today's world, we are seeing so many actual manifestations of this kind of thinking, where people have an idea that the solution is to commit an atrocity of violence. And I just want to say that anybody who is thinking of that, or anybody who knows anybody who has said that they're thinking of something like that, that is the symptom of mental illness. And for the longest time, I held myself accountable in the way that when I came out of the depression, I thought, well, that was silly. I'm never going to do that again, as though I had complete control over what I was thinking and feeling, which I did not. It was the mental illness symptoms. And so I want to let people know that that is not a moral failing on your part if you fall into a psychosis or have these kinds of symptoms. it is not, but you do need help. I needed help. I did not get help at that time. I simply came out of it, and then I went into rise, hypomania and mania. And I continued to go on a roller coaster of ups and downs for about 10 years until I attempted to kill myself. And then I landed in the hospital and in the mental health system, and I started to get help.
You also told me that you tried to cope with your symptoms in a way that turned out to be both addictive and unhealthy for you. Could you share some about that?
Yes, yes. At some point, my voices would tell me that in order to feel better, that I was feeling bad because I had demons in my blood. And so the way to feel better was to cut myself and bleed and let the demons out and get them out of my system. So I did, and I did feel better because you get a certain chemical reaction in your body when you cause pain like that, that gives you some sense of relief. But it became this cycle of my voice is telling me when I started to feel bad again that I needed to cut. And so then I would cut. And then eventually it became into an addictive pattern. And I caught myself one day when I was in basically one of my sacred places. I was at a library and I was in the bathroom stall, pulling out a razor blade from my sock where I had hidden it and cutting. And I realized at that moment that that was very addict behavior, that secrecy and the shame that I felt, and yeah, that hiding away. So I stopped when I realized that it was an addiction pattern. I do have other addiction aspects, but I was able to stop that one.
Did you get specific help on that? You said you stopped, or because force of will can sometimes not be enough for stopping some kind of pattern that's addictive.
That's true. That's true. I mostly just stopped on my own. I did sometimes in the future have other voices that came on that indicated to me that that was what I needed to do for different reasons. And so sometimes I would fall back into it. But in terms of the using it as a solution to feel better, I was able to stop. And part of that, actually, this might sound really weird, but part of it was that I had a cat. I got a cat. And my cat expressed dismay and discomfort in the presence if I were cutting. And so I did not want to affect her that way. So I stopped.
I actually don't think that sounds weird. I've heard similar stories where people can and will do things for the benefit of their animals or children that they wouldn't do otherwise for themselves. So that actually makes a lot of sense. And that's a good reason why sometimes pets can be some of our best friends.
Absolutely.
True to us in ways that sometimes our other loved ones can't. Well, Dr. Davis, can you talk, after hearing their stories, can you talk some about why is early diagnosis and treatment of mental health conditions, especially those that include psychotic symptoms, so important?
Well, the sooner you get treatment, the sooner you are preventing further deterioration of the brain. We see in schizophrenia about a 1% of brain loss matter in 1% of brain matter loss very rapidly. And so getting treatment is, we believe, stopping that process of loss of neurons in different areas of the brain. So it's critical that people recognize they're having it so that they get treatment. And sometimes the people that are going to help basically it's other people in our lives that recognize our behavior is not our usual behavior. So I think it's really important that people get as early treatment as possible, but a lot of times the people themselves aren't going to recognize that they need it. And so it's very important for the other people in their lives to identify that their behavior is changing and that maybe they need help, and to go in and get a good evaluation.
So I'm just wondering, over your many years as a practicing psychiatrist, who your main job is to prescribe medications, how's your approach to treating patients with psychotic symptoms changed?
Well, so when I went into the field, it was such a much darker age in the field of psychiatry. I often talk about psychiatry as being the black sheep in medicine, and that we are now coming out of our dark ages in the field of psychiatry. It's such an exciting time. When I was in training, we had old meds, and they were just coming out with some of the new, what we call atypical antipsychotics. So there were the antipsychotics, meaning the old meds, and then the newer ones. And almost everyone in today's day and age gets treated with a newer one. We hardly ever use the old ones because we've actually found that the old ones can cause some of their own kind of damage. So in the old days, that's all we had. And there were a lot of side effects that no one wanted to ever suffer from just really uncomfortable ones. Most people back in that day would not stay on their medication because they felt so awful, right? They would rather have psychotic symptoms. And back then, we didn't have the information that we do now, that having the psychotic symptoms is actually causing damage, right? So they didn't want to be on those meds. They felt better just having the psychotic symptoms, which, what a horrible choice to have to make. And now people in my practice, they're living normal lives. I'm so excited. I've seen, because I'm a child psychiatrist, getting this diagnosis and knowing that they can live a completely normal life. They have to get treatment. They need to stay on their treatment. We have to find a treatment that hopefully, if possible, has no side effects or the least amount so that it's tolerable, right? So that they can then go live their life and keep their brain healthy. But to me, as I've watched the progression of our field and how rapid our knowledge base is growing, what we know now versus when I went into the field 20 something years ago, I have so much more hope for what's coming down the pipeline. What's really critical right now is people get diagnosed, get treated so they keep their brains healthy, so they have a healthy brain for when we have what are either better treatments or maybe one day cures, because we are in the field of medicine coming up with genetic cures for things that we never thought we might ever cure.
I want to come back to the topic of recovery with you, Kenah. What would you say the turning point for you was when you really began your mental health recovery process, and what made the difference for you at that time?
Well, I have to say, there was one really huge change and then a series of smaller changes. And the one really huge change was actually getting a cocktail of medication that helped me, as opposed to giving me all the side effects that Dr. Davis was just talking about, because I suffered through that for a long time. But yeah, getting a cocktail, and it really was a cocktail, and is like, it's multiple medicines, and some of them are from the old days, and some of them are from more recent, and some of them are newer. So it really needed to come to this point in time where all of them could coalesce into an actual solution for me. And also, I want to speak to the fact that everybody is different. Like, our bodies are all different. So what that cocktail that works for me might not work for Tim. He might have a totally different cocktail and a different solution. So that's really important, I think, to remember, because I did stick with it for a really long time, like decades of taking these different medications and just being a guinea pig and suffering through the bad side effects. And starting with the Thorazine and having the Thorazine shuffle, I mean, it was bad. But now there are these other medications, and there is hope, and that there are more, as Dr. Davis said, more coming down the pipeline, is tremendously hopeful, I think. And it is a combination. It's a complex problem, so it requires a complex solution, I think.
I understand you also take your mental health recovery very seriously at this point in your life. What does that mean to you, and what does that look like now in your life?
Yes, absolutely. I always have in the background of my mind how my mental health is doing, and I'm constantly doing checks on myself throughout the day, like, how is my mood, how is my energy, what are my thoughts like? And it may not be those exact concise questions, but that feeling, that observance is always going on, so that I'm very super aware of what is going on. And the reason why that's important is because I can catch at an earlier stage, before things get all blown out and into an acute psychotic state. Like, oh, I was kind of having some thoughts that were akin to those thoughts I had back when I was in the hospital that last time. And so for me, it's being super aware. I have a lot of support. I go to at least 5 support groups a week, and they're from different places. So I have a broad base of support.
Tim, I also want to turn to you. How about you? Was there a specific point when you started to take caring for your mental health more seriously, and what led to that turning point for you?
Yeah, there was. I had 2 back-to-back like hospitalizations. Actually, my first 2 hospitalizations in a 1 month span at age 27. And essentially, when I was in doing my kind of 2 little stints there, one of the things people told me was take baby steps back towards it. That was a very big turning, because at the time, the time prior, I had been trying to get better in leaps and bounds. It was like I would get better, get better, and then all of a sudden try and go back to school and take 15 units, and all of a sudden, 2/3 of the way through the semester, I'm psychotic and I'm barely holding on by a shoestring, and feeling even worse because your grades that were once doing okay are now tanking, and there was all kinds of stuff that was going on. It kind of would even be like, personal life, friends, everything kind of builds back up and then it all crumbles. And I think the turning point for me was someone telling me just take baby steps, and me wanting to get back on a more solid footing.
What does mental health recovery mean to you today? Like, how do you take care of your mental health now?
How do I take care of my mental health now? Well, I sleep, I eat at regular intervals, I eat well, as much as I can. And I, try to do things with my life that I feel like matter. I try to give back a little bit here and there by volunteering with NAMI. I try to kind of give back to my peer community by working as a peer counselor. And I think that just having work even helps me take care of myself. It gives me a sense of purpose in my life, and it gives me something to get out of bed for in the morning. I can't do it every day, and I can't do it as often as other people do, but just having that part-time gig there really does add a lot of zest to life, so to speak.
Yeah, and I know when we were talking about you coming on the show, and I asked you a similar kind of question, you were very organized in how you had this priority list. Do you want to share anything from your sort of priority list of taking care of yourself?
I think that my priority list kind of goes sleep, diet, socializing, drinking water, just things of that nature. And I wanted to add I can't even think straight without my meds. It's literally a matter of thinking, from A to W to M to Y versus A to B to C to D. So as far as the alphabet goes, so I just want to kind of say how important that is. Number one on the priority list, and also on the priority list is exercise. That's another big one.
You're listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss. Today we're discussing psychotic symptoms and the illnesses that can cause them. We're talking about how to recognize them, how to treat them, how to manage them, and sometimes how to live with them. We're joined by Dr. Jennifer Davis, who is board certified as both a general and a child and adolescent psychiatrist, as well as peer counselor Tim Beveridge, who is in recovery from schizoaffective bipolar disorder and anxiety, and peer support group leader Kenah Roberts, who lives with and manages schizoaffective bipolar disorder and PTSD. Back to our interview. Well, I do want to ask if there are specific resources that you'd want to share with listeners, Dr. Davis, that could be helpful for those living with a mental illness that involves psychotic symptoms.
Well, Deborah, I gave you a list of those references, and on that list, one of them specifically is it's a reference that you can go to, and it has questions that you can answer to sort of tease out if you yourself might be having any of those psychotic symptoms. So that's just a nice screener for people to take a look at if they have any kind of questions or doubts. And then there's also a questionnaire there, that another reference that they can take and talk through with their own practitioner, their own mental health provider, so that then they can further tease it out to help make that decision if they are indeed suffering from these kinds of symptoms.
What about you, Tim? Are there resources that you have found to be particularly valuable in your own recovery?
I have a few. Yeah. One is Being Gray Bears. It's a local nonprofit thrift store. They're also a food distribution and recycling center. It's a place where you can go and essentially get some cheap goods if you ever need them. They have a lot of good things like cheap furniture and, cheap electronics, computers. So, it's kind of one of those good places to go if you're on a budget and need to get some, home essentials, or, even like I mentioned, something to get on the internet with. They do have a food distribution center, as I said, and they do give away food to people who are in need. So that is definitely a plus. You can get a bag that has some basics like bread, fruits, vegetables, and some basic grains, and it'll take care of you for the week. That's for sure. And another resource I have to share is NAMI Santa Cruz County. It's our local Santa Cruz chapter of NAMI. It's a really good place. We have various support groups, one being for peers, another being for families. And we also have a peer-to-peer and family-to-family education course. It's really a great place for peers. I know for myself, I found a lot of great social connections there. There was a lot of times, especially during the pandemic, I was feeling lonely, and I was able to get on there and have a good social connection with people, and we were able to kind of work together, and with empathy, of course, on some of our daily problems.
That's just for listeners. NAMI is National Alliance on Mental Illness, and there is a Santa Cruz chapter. There's also a national organization that has a website that is just chocked full of really helpful information, education, advocacy information, all kinds of things. Those will be listed in our show notes.
And one last resource I have to share is a video game, actually. It's called Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice. And the reason I recommend a video game is that it is a very accurate portrayal of what auditory hallucinations are like.
That would be interesting for people, maybe if they have a loved one who is having that experience, to get a feel for what that might be like for the person.
Absolutely. The first time I showed it to my mom, she went, "Oh my gosh, this is what it's like for you," so it's definitely an eye-opening experience.
Kenah, are there any resources that you use and you'd like to share with our listeners too?
Yes, I did give a pretty long list of some things that are going to show up on the show resources. So I urge people to go and check that out. But also, especially, I think useful is the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, also known as WRAP, which was developed by Mary Ellen Copeland. And it's just a very practical approach to getting an awareness of your health and also your illness, and what that looks like when you go from health to illness, finding out your warning signs and being able to figure out a plan of action for if you start to slide into a problem zone. So that is super helpful. And there are all kinds of aspects of WRAPs to address different issues. But basically, I think if you just Google WRAP, WRAP, Mary Ellen Copeland, you can find a resource. And I think there might even be an actual website associated with that. Anyway, that is one. And then I would say definitely for me, in learning to cope with my voices, there's a book titled Living with Voices, 50 Stories of Recovery by Marcus Rahm et al. And it gave me a framework for understanding kind of the theoretical concept of hearing voices. And it also gave me the practical aspect of seeing they're just short form, like a page or two each for each person, what their journey was like with their voices and learning to cope with them in a healthy way.
Thank you. That sounds incredibly helpful. We really do have to wrap. And now, as much as we could keep on talking, there's a lot more I know we could be covering. But Dr. Davis, what do you think are the most important first few steps for a person who is just newly diagnosed with a mental health condition that includes psychotic symptoms? Just 1, 2, 3. What do you think the top most important steps would be?
Educate themselves on what they're dealing with. Understand it to the fullest capacity that they can, so that they understand why all of the forms of self-care, that being taking their medication, making sure that they're eating well, making sure that they're sleeping well, making sure they're getting exercise, making sure they're being social, right? I think it's really important for them to have a good support network, and going to groups such as those that are presented by NAMI will help them have that wonderful support group. So those would be the tops, I think, right? But it comes down to understanding what they're dealing with so they know why they're working so hard at being healthy.
Tim, what are the last few things you'd want to share with our listeners? This might be something you wish you had understood, earlier in your mental health recovery, or anything else.
Well, I have a couple, and I'll keep them brief. Recovery is possible, and that no one single recovery will look the same. And I think I'll just leave it at that.
Kenah, are there a last couple of thoughts that you'd want to share or leave our listeners with?
Sure, I would echo Tim's sentiments. Those are fabulous. So that, and then I would say, just to remember that we are all a kaleidoscope of aspects of wonderfulness and strengths and humanity, and you're the whole picture. And an episode of psychosis or a mental illness is one part of it, and just to keep in perspective the wholeness of yourself. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that for anybody who is listening who has really lost hope in their life, I want to say that peers like Tim and myself, we are holding the hope for you. And when you are ready, it will be here for you.
Well, that concludes the interview portion of our program. Next, we hear from Adrienne Bernard, a community member who previously sent us an In Your Voice recording for episode 54 on the healing power of making art that was part of our Creativity and Wellness series. That audio piece and the images of his artwork that he shared with us was what got us interested to make today's show on the topic of psychosis. For more than 30 years, Adrienne has lived with schizophrenia and during that time has often experienced psychotic symptoms. He now works as a manager at a hospital alternative peer respite facility and is currently in school to get his master's degree in social work. Adrienne shares with us some of his thoughts and insights about psychosis. Here's Adrienne.
Hello, listeners. My name is Adrienne Bernard. It took me a long time to get through states of madness. I heard a lot of voices over the years, and still do to this day. When I first heard them, they were much stronger and more compelling to listen to. Not that they're not compelling to listen to now, but there was just a sky full of singing voices, and I could see them in a sense, or feel them, that they were there. They told me things like how special I was or how horrible I was, really. So I had to identify as the hero and the monster of my own story, which made it incredibly difficult to adapt in the world around me. I had friends who offered support, teachers whose family took me in, and I found ways to assimilate this harsh reality into something meaningful and tangible and explorable. So I say all this because it's very compelling to be in this state of madness. Though I'm starving, not sleeping, isolated for the most part, there's still something sweet about that. There's still something beautiful about that experience. There's something very rich and deep. I always told myself that through the suffering that I was making me stronger. And so in that strength, I started to cultivate a way of being with the world, a way of understanding the world. To me, it was a spirit world, nothing short of just being in some land of spirit. I guess I say all this because as hard as it was, impossible really, I was facing horrible terrors and exquisite bliss, but a lot of it was suffering. But the thing about that state of consciousness for me it's very seductive. Though I haven't been to the hospital in about 20 something years, 22 years I think, 20 years now, there's part of me that still yearns for that space, to be in that space, to explore that space. Not only for the riches that it yields in my heart and my soul, but also just because it's so fascinating to be not of this world, to be something wholly different from a normal, sane society. So while I don't have to resist the urge to go there anymore, I feel comfortable and calm in this world. I like stability now. I can't emphasize enough just how darn compelling that is. But no more for me if I can help it. Suffering is not a prerequisite towards spirituality anymore.
I want to say a huge thank you again to our guests today, Dr. Jennifer Davis, Tim Beveridge, and Kenah Roberts. And thanks to you for joining us here on State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I want you to know that new episodes of State of Mind, exploring mental health and wellness, are released the first Sunday of every month and can be found along with our complete archive on our website, www.stateofmindmedia.org. Also, if you found today's show interesting and you'd like to learn more, or you're looking for resources for yourself or a loved one, check out the resource list in the show notes. It includes everything we talked about in the interview today and many more. If you missed part of this episode or just want to hear it again, subscribe to our podcast on all the major podcast platforms. Also, when you rate and review our podcast, you actually help it get found and heard by more listeners. So if you liked this or any of our episodes, could you please do that for us? Special thanks to Jeannie Baldzakowski for audio production, to Patrice Vecchione for In Your Voice story coaching, and to Lisa Herendine for research. And thanks to acoustic guitarist Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. State of Mind was developed and originally broadcast in association with KSQD-FM in Santa Cruz, California. We always want to hear from listeners and community members just like you. You can submit your very own In Your Voice recording and become part of the conversation by either calling in to leave a message or record your audio file right on your phone. Either way, tell us about a mental health experience you've had, something that's contributed to your mental health recovery, or share a resource that's been helpful for you. We're now looking for In Your Voice contributions from people who have experience with the profound grief associated with losing a child at any age, and with ketamine-assisted therapy. We really do want to hear from you, and your voice may just be on one of our future shows. Submission details can be found at www.stateofmindmedia.org. Come on back and join us again next month for a whole new episode of State of Mind. And until then, live well.